Hi, this is Pastor Barry with another installment of Themes of the Upper Story, this one on chapters 14 and 15. And what I'd like to do is to take a look at those chapters in the bigger context of the narrative up to this point. If you've been following the arc of the Upper Story, you know by now that what has happened repeatedly is that God has reached out to his people in love, hoping to establish a marriage-like relationship with them. One of intimacy and faithfulness, one that is exclusive and permanent. We see this from the very beginning when God makes the man and the woman and he puts them in the garden. But he doesn't leave them alone. He walks with them in the cool of the garden and converses with them. This is a picture of the life that God wanted with people, to be able to be present with them, to be able to be known by them and to communicate with them and to commune with them. And of course, the first man and the first woman turn from God. They choose an independent life, a life on their own terms rather than God's terms. And all of creation falls into evil and death. But God does not give up on creation. He promises to redeem humanity and all of creation, and he begins, or I don't know that he only begins it, but in part he does this by calling a people for himself who will be an object lesson to the rest of the world. They will be God's people living under God's reign in God's land. They're a picture of the kingdom of God. And we see this in the time of Abraham and Sarah, who received that promise of the land and the promise to be made into a people. We see God protecting his people. One of the times we see that is during the time of Joseph, when he protects them from famine. We see him deliver his people from years of slavery in Egypt during the time of Moses and lead them into the promised land during the time of Joshua. Now, the other consistent pattern of the story up to this point is that God's people continue to rebuff him again and again. The story is not the story of the people who tried really hard to keep the law and just weren't quite able to do it. They simply will not be faithful to the relationship. We see this during the time of Judges, when it says that the people do what is right in their own eyes. That's a way of saying that they ignore the kingship of God. And then eventually they outright reject it when they ask for a human king. And God gives them kings as per their request. But in most cases, the kings are not faithful. And in some cases, actually lead them away from the intimate, exclusive covenant relationship that God intends. Now, you can't just blame the kings. The people themselves are disobedient, and they keep worshiping other gods. Sometimes instead of God, sometimes in addition to God. They continue to worship the one true God. They just worship him alongside these other gods. They kind of mix things. And so we are now in a section of the narrative where God's judgment is increasingly apparent. We see this in the dividing of the kingdom. The northern, larger half becomes Israel, and the southern half ends up being called Judah. We see this in the spiritual decline of the nation. If you compare the things that happened during this section of the story to that high point of King David's devotion and passion for God. And we see it in the normalization of injustice, in how the people of God end up mistreating each other. And yet, God has not given up on his people. He's still trying to find a way to save the relationship, to make it work. And so he sends prophets to call them back to himself. I don't know what you think of when you think of prophets, what the purpose of a prophet is. Some people think that the primary purpose of the prophets is to tell the future In English, we often use the word that way. We say that someone's a prophet. We mean that they can tell what's going to happen next. Sometimes people think of prophets as miracle workers, and prophets were, in fact, both of those things. But at the core, the thing that all the prophets had in common was that they called people back to God. They called them to be faithful to the relationship with God. But part of what we see in this section of the story is that God's patience, while great, is not infinite. And just foreshadowing a little bit of what's coming next in the coming chapters, very soon God is going to give the people what they want. They don't want an exclusive covenant relationship with God. They want a different kind of life, a life on their own terms that includes the worship of other gods. And eventually, God gives them their desire. They get to find out what life is like outside of that intimate, loving relationship with God. And the result is that they lose their land, their king, and their temple. Essentially, a life apart from God ends up being a life of enslavement and death. And just kind of sort of shifting gears into talking about what it means for us, the same things are true today. Whatever we learn in any particular part of one of these smaller, lower stories within the bigger story, part of what we should see here is that God's desire is for a certain kind of relationship with us. And God is patient. He keeps coming back to us. He keeps trying to find a way to make the relationship work. But God's patience is not infinite. There is a limit to the patience of God, and we dare not test it. And so kind of summarizing some of what we see in chapters 14 and 15, we see the splitting of the kingdom. And so the way the story now gets told is in two parallel stories. One for the kings of the north, all of whom are evil, and one parallel track of stories for the kings of the south, some of which are good, most of which also are evil. We see the people of God torn not just politically, but also they're in constant conflict with one another. They almost actually go to war with one another, and God warns them not to go to war with each other, and yet they are often at odds. In the north, part of the reason that all the kings are evil is they get off to a bad start. The first king, Jeroboam, decides for political reasons that he will set up new centers of worship. He's afraid because the southern kingdom has Jerusalem and the temple, and he's afraid that if people go back there to worship, they will remain loyal to the southern king and kingdom. And so instead, he sets up a couple of places in the north with a couple of golden calves where people can worship God in the north. But God says that what he has done is idolatry. And so all the kings of the north end up following this sin of Jeroboam, that he led the people into this idolatrous worship for the sake of political expediency. In the south, things are only a little bit better. And what we find in between these few good kings, I think there are like 4 of them or something, is people worshiping in the high places, which is where other gods were worshipped. God was supposed to be worshipped at the temple. We see poles set up for the worship of Asherah, another goddess, and even male shrine prostitutes. The people of God become like the people that they were supposed to push out of the promised land. And in the end, the people of God become like everybody else. And this is exactly a repudiation of the calling that God has placed on their lives. They are called to be separate. They are called to be exclusively God's and to belong to God and to worship God and to treat one another the way that God says, but instead they end up mimicking the people that were under the judgment of God. And so, not surprisingly, they too come under the judgment of God. The judgment of God is pronounced on them repeatedly during this time, and it is enacted. We see this in symbolic form in scenes like the one where Shishak of Egypt takes the gold items out of the temple. All of that gold in the temple is supposed to represent the glory of God, this beautiful, precious thing that lives in the temple, represented by all this gold. And so it ends up all being replaced with bronze. It ends up being replaced with a lower kind of glory. And then, of course, lastly, we see that God has not given up on the relationship, that he continues to send prophets. They come with signs and power, demonstrating the power of God's kingship. They come in great devotion. They come calling the people of God back to the worship of God. We even see this enacted in the life of Hosea, who is a prophet who marries a prostitute who is unfaithful to him, and he actually goes back to try to save the relationship, to buy her back out of slavery, and to make her holy and to renew the relationship with her. What we will see as we go forward in these chapters of the story is what happens with God's people. And what we find is that though they return to him for short periods of time, at least in the south, in the end, neither the northern kingdom nor the southern kingdom will remain faithful to God. And so the judgment of God becomes inevitable. What can we gain from this? Well, one thing that we learn is that God is not someone to be trifled with. We often want to think of God as this kindly, grandfatherly figure who kind of spoils us. You know, he doesn't really discipline us. But the Bible doesn't say that God is like that. The Bible says that God does discipline those he loves. Hebrews 12:6. And one of the ways that we know that we are sons and daughters of God is that God doesn't let us run wild, that God will finally draw some boundaries and give us some consequences. Secondly, I think we learned that the judgment of God is actually good news. The judgment of God comes to keep us from the things that will destroy us, that will ruin our lives. And so it's a severe kind of love that God uses to try to save our lives, like a parent who is very stern with a child who keeps trying to run into the street. God is trying to do his best to save our lives, to keep us from harm and to give us life. But he often does that with the discipline of judgment. Lastly, I'll just say this. We are now about 6 weeks from the end of this section of the story. In 6 weeks, we'll have finished the entire Old Testament part of the story. And this is a good time for you and your group to begin thinking about how you want to close things out for the spring and how you want to handle things for the summer. So make sure that you take some time in your group to talk about what you want to do for the summer. Are you going to take a rest? Are you going to meet as prayer partners? Are you going to meet once a month socially? Are you going to continue to study, but just study something different? What are you going to do with your summer? And how do you want to go into the fall? Are you going to multiply your group? Are you going to change leadership? This is the time to begin to talk about those things. Well, God bless you if you've gotten this far. Have a great time, in the story of God.